This will be a quick video on dialectics and Syria. So the first thing to examine is the liberal support for Palestine. Traditionally, liberals are eager to support whatever they think, whatever is popular. They will support all kinds of things if the media pushes them to do that. Now, our media propping up Israel is the foundation of settler colonialism and upholding capitalism and upholding imperialism. But the second Holocaust, the Holocaust of Palestine, was so big that liberals, even liberals, supported Palestine to a very, very significant degree. Now, they weren't organizing very firmly. They weren't speaking hard against capitalism and settler colonialism because that would require them to fight locally across North America. So there was a very great deal of them who were supportive and some were wishy-washy apologists, as we witnessed. I think discussing this and the dialectics of this is very important because most people don't have the time to specialize in geopolitics. Now, a focus of dialectics is to look at something and to look and examine at all the forces, both within it and the external forces acting upon it, and to look at both sides of something, to look at the strengths and weaknesses of something, and to look at something in the greatest depth that you can. And a Marxist focus too, in examining a country when it comes to the ongoing and contemporary circumstances. We don't look at it from a different country. We look at it from the surrounding conditions and the prior history. So right now, the most pertinent example is Syria, where Syria is being overthrown by US, Turkish, and Israeli forces. Now, Israel has occupied the Golan Heights, which is Syrian land, for a long time, and we will see that that land will not be returned to Syria. Instead, we will see Israel increase its expansion and genocide. To all the people who are celebrating the coup of Syria right now, they will be horribly mistaken and they will be grieving the massive suffering that will go on in Syria in the coming years. And having dialectical thinking, it lets us examine something in so much depth and being able to have very honest and very open discussion about something, to be able to be vulnerable about something and to not hide any just criticism of the thing. This prevents us from falling into the trap of needing to see something in a binary or to reduce it to a false dichotomy. This is what the gift of Marxism does. It lets us examine something in this depth so that we can see that something isn't simply good and it isn't simply bad. With dialectics, there's an idea of it that there is good and bad in everything. With Syria, if we use dialectics, we can hear from Syrians directly and hear that they're incredibly frustrated with their previous government. That is a complete, just, and fair thing for them to feel and talk about. Now, if that thing is true over here, it doesn't necessarily mean that that the process that needs to happen is the opposite, where the country should be overthrown by a US power or any foreign power. Because that is the legacy of all Western interference for the last several hundred years. So it's very critical to be able to let people feel their feelings and not dismiss those feelings, but also be extremely critical of the Western interference. Because of the lack of dialectics and the lack of Marxist analysis, the lack of geopolitical analysis, the lack of history, and the lack of really good news and geopolitical experts, there is a really, really big tendency for liberals to tokenize Syrians and say, oh yeah, the Syrian, they're tired of the government. Yes. And that's true. Sure, that person might be tired of their government, but it doesn't mean that the solution is a foreign power conquering and destroying the government. That liberal doesn't come to the conclusion that the US and other countries should lift the sanctions on Syria or support them or do any number of things that are complete opposite to what they're actually doing, which is waging genocide and stealing all the oil. So one thing related to Syria and the US funding terrorist groups, funding mercenaries, training mercenaries, having tons of mercenaries claim to be Islamic, but they're not, they're just mercenaries, is the long history of them being put into that region by France, Britain, and the US. And not just Syria. This is extensively done against Iran. This is extensively done against multiple other countries there. On Instagram in particular, I see lots of big feminist pages. They will post in support of Palestine, and then not long after, or before, they will show support for color revolutions in various other places. And this is the weakness of tokenizing liberal support. It is ungrounded. It is completely divorced from history, divorced from understanding who is making these things happen. Liberals and anarchists are the most vulnerable people to this, which is why so many liberals supported Palestine, and now so many liberals are supporting the overthrow of Syria. But it's not too surprising because we watched so many liberals and anarchists support the US overthrow of Ukraine, in which the US has more than 100 years of funding white nationalism there. But liberals don't know that history, and anarchists don't know that history. Their heart is in the right place, but their analysis is completely wrong, and they get manipulated because their heart is in the right place. When the media suggests that there is government suppression somewhere, anarchists see that something is being pushed down, so their support is for the people to be pushing up. This is completely ungrounded. It is completely ideal. It's idealism. It's not grounded in the history. It's not grounded in the NATO hegemony of the way things are. And it's really, really sad, actually, that analysis in the West is so limited, and we have this conception of good guys versus bad guys, and that we don't have enough political understanding or comrades or places to gather and discuss and learn and do all these things together, so that so many people's analysis is so freaking limited. To do with Syria and dialectics, a really pertinent example is Iran. Now, in Iran, the US overthrew the country in 1954 or 1953. I forget which year. It's one of those 2 years. The other one of those 2 years, the US overthrew Guatemala. And there is a great deal of propaganda on Facebook, and it's extremely Islamophobic. And this is how it works. The history is buried. And then there will be a post where it'll show women without a burqa in a particular year. And it'll say 1979, which is before the Islamic Revolution destroyed the American puppet. And so many anarchists and Western liberals will look at that example and say, oh yeah, the country was so much better when women weren't inhibited by Islam. We should overthrow the country again. Or they don't say that we should overthrow the country again, but it's implicit, it's implied when they are upholding the way things were under the American puppet government. But it just shows an extremely small sliver that those people uphold and believe in. So there is an extreme Western chauvinism and a massive, massive Western-centric focus that centers anti-theism and dismisses the history of a culture, the history of a nation, the culture of a nation, and all the things that go with it. And they suggest that our way is better. Us putting our values there is superior. I think one last thing I'd like to mention is just like, with the Marxist analysis and dialectics, we aren't stuck having to defend something as perfect or condemn something as perfectly awful. We can look at it and have just critique. And with that, we can look at the legacy of what the US has done in any given place, and then we can see tons of other examples. And that lets us examine something in the sea of propaganda. Because today, you can get a liberal to admit that the US should not have been in Afghanistan. But that liberal won't know that there's actually more people gonna die in Afghanistan from the sanctions and frozen assets that the US is currently putting on it than from the 20-year, $2 trillion occupation of that land. More people will die now from sanctions under the rules-based order than actual warfare. If you have time, I have a 12-minute piece on the dialectics of Western perspectives of Iran. I would highly recommend that. If you have time, it is very pertinent to perspectives and dialectics of people not being in a good position to be able to honestly and fairly critique their country from a settler state due to the conditions of liberals and colonists around them tokenizing them and divorcing the geopolitical reality of their country versus what our imperial powers are doing to their country. I think one horrible example to use, very effective, dark, awful example to use, is the American Revolution. Now, to libertarians, it's a very great, bold thing for them, because you have a group of colonists who are rejecting British colonialism and saying, we want this land for us to do what we will. Now, if you're a colonist American, you would see yourself as the good guy and the British as the bad guys. Now, if you're the British, you see yourself as the good guys and the Americans as the bad guys. But if you use dialectics and you examine the broader conditions, you examine the prior history and external factors, you can see that there's indigenous people being massacred and having one colonial douchebag swapped for another colonial douchebag. Sorry, one more annoying thing to mention really quickly, because it's very annoying and it's been getting thrown around so much in the last little while, is great man of history theory, where instead of talking about a country or a US's interests in that country and its resources and the expropriation of its land and labor, they reduce everything, all the genocide and sanctions and everything that is done against that country, and they say, oh, it's okay because this guy is a bad guy and we gotta hate that guy, and we're gonna undialectically reduce everything in the region to this one guy and the things that we claim about him, so that whatever horrible things we do, it's justified because he's a bad guy. And it's easy to do this because it takes energy to look into things, and people are xenophobic and ignorant and conditioned to have these imperial narratives and to be accepting of them.